Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 348 of your Tick Bootcamp podcast. The title of today's interview is Reorigins of Neuroplasticity, an interview with Ben Ahrens. My name is Richard Johannesson.
And I'm Matt Sabatello.
Folks, we've become the dominant species on Earth as a result of our adaptive nature, meaning we have neuroplastic brains and we have epigenetics that allows us to be adaptive to our environment. Unfortunately, Lyme disease and ticks have used our neuroplasticity and our epigenetics against us. And this young man who suffered from Lyme disease for a long period of time has created a company that helps us to rewire our brains so that what Lyme disease has done to us is not causing us to suffer the long-term effects of a chronic illness.
Rich, what I really enjoyed about this interview with Ben is how he talks about almost all chronic Lyme disease cases end up being self-perpetuating inflammatory conditions. And he goes on to say, and this is a little controversial, that it starts in our heads and it ends in our heads. And what he means by that is it's not psychological, it's neurological. And our brains are malleable, and we can work with our brains to help our bodies overcome this chronic illness. And we shouldn't ever give up, and we need to have hope that healing is possible.
Healing is possible, Matt, and one of the pieces of the puzzle for many folks are going to be this neuroplasticity and the retraining of our brain. And we have someone who is going to give folks insight and clues on how to do that. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce Ben Ahrens to the Tick Bootcamp community. Hey, Ben Ahrens, and welcome to the Tick Bootcamp podcast.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
We are really excited to have you. So Ben, first talk to us about Reorigin and the company that you are the co-founder of.
Yeah, sure. So Reorigin is a neuroplasticity company. It was founded in 2020, and it is really aimed 100% at helping people to reclaim their health by rewiring their brains. And so what I mean by that is that there is, as we all know, and as I'm sure we'll get into, there is a unfortunately growing number of people who are finding themselves afflicted by these what's known as self-perpetuating inflammatory types of conditions. Lyme disease falls into this category, so does long COVID, so do other forms of so-called post-infectious syndrome. But essentially, these are becoming more and more understood as full brain body neurological and biological and physiological conditions that require a very sort of holistic approach. And part of that approach that seems to be beneficial for a lot of people is addressing the brain and the nervous system. And so Reorigin is really aimed at helping people learn how to retrain their own brain, applying science-backed techniques. The company was, and the program was designed by neuroscience experts, PhD neuroscientists, and clinical psychologists. I helped put it together as someone who's actually experienced one of these conditions, long-term, late-stage Lyme disease, which we'll get into. And everyone on the team, including myself, other coaches, moderators, and my co-founders, have all been through our own pretty radical healing journey actually from chronic Lyme disease, which led us to create Reorigin.
All right, so Ben, we shared with you that the reason we invited you onto this podcast, and as you know, this is a podcast that profiles superheroes and superpowers, is because you have actually identified a superpower, maybe the superpower that every single human being has, right? That's neuroplasticity. So why don't we begin by defining neuroplasticity and how you discovered that superpower during the course of your healing journey from Lyme disease?
Sure. So neuroplasticity is, at the most basic sense, your brain's natural ability to change its structure and function. And I fully agree. I think this is the most superpower that every single person has. I actually became really fascinated with the concept of plasticity and malleability at a really young age. I was always into exercise science and exercise physiology. I got my career start out of college as a personal trainer, and I worked with a lot of people. I developed a specialty in corrective exercise and post-stroke rehabilitation. So I worked with a lot of people who had injuries and neurological issues. And I was just fascinated that people, through their own actions, could change the way their body functions. And as I learned more about, the body, how it's controlled by the brain, that what they're really doing is changing the way their brain is structured and functions. And so that seed was planted in my mind, at a relatively early age. Then around my mid-20s, I got extremely sick, and it was a crazy experience because I went from being this sort of picture of health. I was a traveling surfer. I had a surf camp in Eastern Long Island in the summers. During the winters, I would be a personal trainer. I ended up training a lot of athletes and celebrities, and was just sort of, I wrote a fitness column for a local newspaper, and I just had my whole identity wrapped up in health and being this picture of good health. And around age 24, 25, I started to get these weird symptoms. And then it was like overnight, after a travel experience and a lot of fatigue and some stress and other things we can get into, it was pretty much night and day. I woke up in bed one morning just shivering, seeing spots, and the rest is history. Landed me in bed for 3 years. It sent me down this whole journey, and ultimately led me through, I would say, just about every aspect of conventional and non-conventional medicine, and ultimately back up the chain to the brain, which is where I found the most possibility.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the upstream and downstream tools that you use to heal, and because you are, folks, who are only listening to this podcast, because it is an audio-only podcast, cannot see you, but we can share with them. You appear to be an uber fit young man now, and you were a uber fit young man before you went on your journey. So there was this gap between the uber fit athletic young man who was writing a column about fitness, and the guy who appeared before us today. But before we get to that part of your journey, I want to walk it back a little bit further, right? So are you a native Long Islander? Did you grow up here on Long Island?
I did, yeah. I grew up in Montauk, and then went to school in Sag Harbor, then moved further west and went to middle school and high school in the city. But initially Long Island, I definitely consider my home.
All right. So, of course, Long Island is the home to Lyme disease, although the disease was not named here because of the cluster that was identified by a very active pair of moms. But we have had contact with Lyme disease during all of Long Island history. In fact, one of the earlier names of Lyme disease was the Montauk knee. So you grew up in the heart of Lyme country, right? Your entire life you spent in Lyme country, or in the Lyme belt, as we call it. So talk to us about what you knew about ticks and tick diseases before you got chronically ill.
Yeah. So I knew about it from a really young age. Although I will say, the worst cases I knew were people that had gotten it, maybe gotten sick for 3 or 6 months, and then seemed to get better. It wasn't in the forefront of my mind, especially as a kid who just, you got your life ahead of you. You're all healthy and running around. I'll say me and my sister definitely grew up picking ticks off each other. I remember my dad had this method of, burning them off our backs with a match head so they'd back out, and then he'd, pull them out. And I did.
Terrible. That's terrible.
Is it? Okay. So don't do that. But I did actually have, a number of symptoms even as a kid. I had my joints would get inflamed. I had neck pain, popping that would always happen. I even went to the doctors about it. And I got diagnosed at one point, age 12, I think, with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. But, as someone who's relatively young and healthy without an additional allostatic load, the body can actually handle a tremendous amount of stuff. And as I'm sure there's actually many people who I'm sure have Borrelia or some other co-infections and would test positive for those, but don't necessarily exhibit all of the harsh symptoms of chronic Lyme disease. And so we can get into
Ben,
kind of
let me just stop you there for a second. We know that 15% of the world's population has the antibodies for Lyme disease, right? So and the number is growing, but literally 15% of the world's population has that now.
Yep. And my stepfather is a great example. He's one of these people that will constantly, whenever he gets tested, he tests positive for Lyme, but has never had a symptom in his life. He's 84 years old now. And after getting sick and going down this rabbit hole, just jumping around a little bit here, I went to a talk by Dr. Thomas Rao at the Marion Institute in Massachusetts, biological medicine. And in that talk, he mentioned that if you start pulling people off the streets in the Northeast where we live, he estimated roughly 40 or more % of people would test positive for Lyme. But as he put it, less than 2% would actually have Lyme disease, which means the symptomatic expression of the condition.
All right. So, and actually, we'll one up you on that. When we interviewed Dr. Bill Rawls, the author of Unlocking Lyme and the Cellular Wellness Solution, he actually argued that on Long Island, if we tested everyone, more than 90% of the people in our community would actually test positive for Lyme disease. So it is a huge problem. And I think what's important that we footnote for a moment with you is you're clearly a very smart young man. You are very articulate. You are, you have a family structure. You were getting bitten by ticks on a regular basis. So despite being smart, despite being aware, despite being uber fit, all of those pieces did not come together to put you in a position where you could keep yourself healthy and safe from Lyme disease, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So we need more than awareness, right? Because awareness is not going to keep you safe. You need more than being intelligent. You're a smart guy and you couldn't keep yourself you couldn't keep yourself healthy. And you need to be more than uber fit, because you are not only uber fit generally and able to manage these microbes in your body for a long time, but unfortunately, and as a fitness professional and as somebody who was working in this industry and writing in this industry, you still had a moment in time where you became immunocompromised and you ultimately lost the ability to keep yourself healthy from these microbes.
Yeah. In retrospect, one of the biggest things I learned, and this is something I learned from doing some research into a lot of biological medicine, but yeah, mainly it's really this total load theory, and I really came to understand that the Lyme or the bacteria infection was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, but the camel's back might not have broken if it wasn't carrying some other heavy load. That prompted the question, well, what constitutes that load? As you said, I'm healthy, I'm young, I'm relatively fit.
You're a professional athlete too, by the way, right? You were a professional athlete. You were a professional athlete at the time that you had gotten sick.
Professional athlete, yeah, traveling surfer. And which, by the way, just to put a footnote in that, athletes are not necessarily the most healthy. Fitness does not always dovetail perfectly with health, resilience, and longevity. I think there's actually certainly can be a divergence when you're going for high performance. There's other ends of the spectrum that take a hit, but generally, yeah, I mean, very healthy, felt great, had tons of energy, was strong, and then things sort of built up. I mentioned I was running this surf camp on Long Island. Great fun, a lot of responsibility, a lot of stress. There was also some childhood issues and sort of traumas and things under the surface, which sort of came out later that I realized I had to reprocess. And, we know that, I love this analogy in European biological medicine. They always put up this giant barrel and they say, okay, your system is like this big barrel, and we can handle, as human beings, an incredible amount of stress and pathogens and toxicity and negative thoughts and all of the rest. Like we are really, really resilient creatures, but we are also finite. We are human, and there is a limit to how much our system can handle. And when our capacity to recover from a stressor is exceeded by the number of stressors in the barrel, and by stressors, I'm saying these can be all different things. They can be physical, toxins. They can be pathogens. They can be stressful events, childhood experiences, genetic, issues that have been handed down. All of these things can certainly reach a certain point where there's a sort of breaking of the dam. And it's at that point that we start to experience symptoms at first, then maybe getting run down. And then if things really persist, as they did, for me, or really overwhelms the system, what we find is this almost sort of short circuiting of the nervous system and the immune system. And now the body is kind of sent into this tailspin where it just can't really find its footing and homeostasis on its own.
So talk to us about your pot boiling over, and how bad did it get for you? So you gave us this description, and you created this image in our minds about this very athletic, professional athlete and entrepreneur who is now suffering a great deal of stress. Now, you also sort of gave us the preview of having bitten by ticks repeatedly during your life, having a dad that was burning them off of you, which of course made it more likely that you were going to get Lyme disease. And by the way, I can tell you that we during my childhood, we did not remove ticks properly either. So it's not uncommon for folks to use these, use some native knowledge that isn't necessarily supporting us when we're dealing with that, and parents using native knowledge. It's not, fortunately, my mom wasn't burning them off us, but we were putting Vaseline on ours, believing that the tick was going to back out before we pulled it out, which of course, makes things worse as well. But P.S. we now have this, this uber fit young man crashing. So talk to us about the crash, and talk to us about how bad it was for you when you went on that leg of your journey.
Yeah. So stress building up. Summer of, I think it was 2008 or 2009, running this surf camp, not getting a whole lot of sleep, a lot of responsibility, 200 campers, professional camp staff, boats, power boats, jet skis, surfboards, windsurf rigs, all this kind of stuff. A lot to manage for a relatively young guy. And so a lot of stress, not getting a lot of sleep, still training people on the back end of that in the evenings, and just slowly getting worn down. Then that fall, I took a trip to West Africa. I was actually competing in a surf contest there, spoke about this in a TED talk that I gave. And in that contest, it was, I think, like an early morning competition, the morning after a 36-hour flights and travel experience to get to Senegal. I slipped off my board, and it was like my brain just said, no more. Cut power. And my entire body just went limp. And I remember just floating there for minutes. And eventually I could get, that little survival neuron kind of crept back in and allowed me to start to wiggle some limbs and get myself back to shore. And I just remember going into bed and kind of sort of convulsing, muscles contracting, seeing spots, just feeling incredibly ill, like a flu came on immediately. So made my way back home, thought, okay, too much stress, too much travel, rest, chicken soup, that's the call. And that's what I did. And that exhaustion seemed to get worse, if that was even possible. It was like with every amount of space I gave myself, that wave of exhaustion just got deeper and deeper. And probably the best way to describe it, and I've heard others describe it this way as well, it felt like I was under like 10x gravity, laying in bed, just being crushed into my pillow. At the same time, there was all this other stuff going on. There was weird migrating pains, as if I had done like a massive workout, but the soreness would migrate from my left quad to my right shoulder, down my right arm to my fingertips, to my forehead. All of these weird sort of sensations. Sleeping became almost impossible. Sensitivities to light and sound. I had to put garbage bags over the windows, tape over, the VCR. I know a lot of people have this experience as well. A ringing phone sounded like a bomb going off. I was just like absolutely, bombarded. And as I mentioned, blurred vision, thick brain fog. And another thing I mentioned in the TED Talk, which was probably the most pivotal and disturbing moment for me, was one morning shortly after I got home and all these symptoms were coming out, when I tried to sit up in my bed, and I was looking at these spots on the floor, just like with some degree of familiarity, but at the same time, a total disconnect, not knowing what these blurry spots were. And I realized that they're my shoes. And even knowing that they were my shoes, I was like, what are they for? How do I use these things? There was a total disconnect. And there were so many things like that, that felt like, and basically were, signs of dementia, that it was really frightening, and not at all where I ever thought I'd be at age 25.
Well, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how that experience helped you to get to the place where you are now, and the tools you're using to help other folks. But let's stay with this part of your journey. So you now become chronically ill, right? You're bedbound, and your brain is shutting down, your body's shutting down, and that goes on for how long a period of time? How long are you bedbound, and what medical treatment are you seeking to try to overcome the challenges that you now have with even recognizing what shoes are?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So ultimately, that period went on for 3 years. The medical stuff started within the first, I'd say, after 3 or 4 weeks when after all that rest and symptoms were persisting and worsening, I wasn't getting better. I was living in a basement apartment with mold in Eastern Long Island here. Ended up moving back to my mom's house and crashing on her couch. To this day, we joke that she has the same couch. I don't know why, but there is this like permanent dent in the couch where I planted myself for.
Then it's time for you to buy your mom a new couch.
That's the call. Yep. I know I'll get her for her birthday now. So anyway, moved back home, and my mother was just outstanding. You know, she literally took me to these doctor's appointments and started off with the general practitioner who said, yeah, you've been traveling too much. You might, I think he found that I had picked up some sort of stomach, bug there. But anyway, he basically prescribed what I was doing, which was rest, TLC, and chicken soup. So, okay, do more of that. Went back to him after another 3 weeks. Okay, this is you spend a lot of time on Long Island. Let's test you for Lyme. So took the Lyme test. That came back with mixed results. I think it was IgE, positive, indicative of old infection, but not active infection. So he's like, we're not too concerned about that. We'll give you 3 weeks of doxy as a precaution, but that's probably not the issue. Give that another 6 to 8 weeks and wait and see. And ultimately kind of found a new general practitioner who did a lot of testing, and the more you look for, the more you find. And of course, when we're dealing with this type of infectious syndrome, and by syndrome, we mean really multi-systemic, syndrome that affects all systems and cells and organs in the body, you find a lot of stuff. And so he sent me to the cardiologist, who sent me home with a Holter top monitor, who called me in the next day and said, "You're a very sick young man." My heart rate was all over the charts. I had extremely bad POTS, or postural orthostasis tachycardia. If I changed my body's orientation in my bed or sat up in the morning, it was like, just getting hit by a truck. Heart rate would go up to 150 or 180. So, out of that panic, he's like, all right, let's get you to the neurologist. Neurologist did spinal taps, tested the spinal fluid for antibodies of Borrelia, found high titers in the spinal fluid, put me in MRIs, found multiple brain lesions in the frontal cortex. All the while, fear is going on, like all this story is building that I'm just basically, I don't want to curse on this podcast, but
you can.
I'm screwed, So basically, the condition is not, the prognosis does not look good. This phase, went on for years. That led me to antibiotics, cycling all different sorts of antibiotics, which led to killing off all of the bacteria in my gut, which led to horrible, fungal infections. Hence enter, diflucan, nystatin, all of the antifungals. And it's just this constant back and forth between, antibiotics and then killing everything off, and then trying to kind of repair the damage from those. Upgraded to intravenous Rocephin for 1 or 2 6-month periods with a catheter, stitched into the upper arm and inserted in the heart. And there I was on the couch with an oxygen machine and, IV pole. And that's where I stayed. And that was my life for years, all the while trying to figure stuff out. And because of the brain fog and the neurological symptoms, I really couldn't do much reading. But fortunately, there was podcasts were like just becoming a thing, and UC Berkeley was putting some of their 1 and 200 level courses online. And so I was virtually attending courses in neurobiology, and we can get into that as well. But
so let me ask you to pause there for a second, Ben, because we are going to geek out with you on that, and you're doing a great job of outlining the story. But I do have a piece that I think we have to discuss as fellow Long Islanders and as people who are passionate about Lyme disease. One of the things that's jumping out at me is again, you grew up on the Lyme Belt. You're in Lyme Central. You're treating with doctors who are now diagnosing you with maybe acute Lyme disease, but they're really struggling with trying to come up with a diagnosis, and you're spinning down the drain. I mean, you went from being a professional athlete to being almost dead, laying on the couch and creating a dent in your mother's couch, right? I mean, you're being absorbed into this couch and you're getting ready to move on to the other side. And I think in part that's because we didn't have a definition, or the doctors who were evaluating you didn't have a definition for Lyme disease. And what I mean by that is, and you started to touch on that, is that Lyme disease is a disease without a definition. So we here at Tick Bootcamp are now taking control of that process, and we are now going to define Lyme disease for the world. It is not acute disease. It is a multisystemic, it is a polymicrobial, multisystemic, chronic infectious disease. That's what Lyme disease is, and that's what you had, but nobody had a definition that you fell within, and as a result, they were just sort of bouncing around and coming up with a whole bunch of different, diseases that you may have been suffering from because they were never tying it together because they didn't have a definition. Somebody tripped across Lyme. They were treating you for Lyme. They didn't think you had Lyme because they didn't have a proper definition for Lyme disease, right? And they came up with a number of other definitions. Again, as somebody who watched your TED Talk, I know they diagnose you with multiple sclerosis, for example, which is one of the things that we see very often in this community, but they diagnose you with a lot of other things because they didn't really have a bucket in which to drop your symptoms into. So talk to us about what other things they diagnose you with in addition to multiple sclerosis.
Yeah, so MS was one of them based on their finding with the MRIs and brain lesions, spinal taps as well. I mentioned the juvenile rheumatoid arthritis came back on the table. True story. One doctor legitimately recommended that my legs be broken in 4 places and realigned because my knees were off by 4 degrees. And he said, okay, this is putting all this pressure on the fragile, connective tissue and creating further erosion. I was like, I don't know if that sounds like the best solution. So yeah, the juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, POTS I mentioned, chronic fatigue syndrome was definitely thrown out. The important thing to notice here, and what really started to stick out with me, is that these so-called diagnoses are really just descriptive terms. Chronic fatigue syndrome doesn't tell you anything about the cause. It literally means tired all the time.
Right.
So
right. So we have a number of different disorders rather than diseases, right? And that's going to sort of walk us into the next piece of this. So you now start to come up with some solutions to your problem, right? And you feel called to start taking these courses that were being available to you, despite your very fragile physical, emotional, and spiritual condition. So talk about what led you to believe that this was something that was going to be helpful to you, and talk about what you discovered when you started taking these online courses.
Yeah, so I'll say, very upfront, I did not necessarily fully believe that these things would be helpful. I just didn't have anything else to do, or that was more important, than kind of, it started really like grasping at straws. The things that I had initially grasped at, and I think everyone unfortunately goes through this experience where you really, really put your trust and faith into, the mainstream, the medical doctors, as people that we look to as someone who knows more than we do. And when that fails to yield an adequate result, it's sort of devastating. It's sort of like paradigm busting, because we're like, oh man, like I was relying on this infrastructure, on these people, on this education, this knowledge, and this is really coming up short. So I certainly went through all the emotional phases of like, just feeling like I had the ground, like the rug pulled out from under my feet. What can be done now? And so I started with kind of turning to the things that I knew or that I had experienced before. And some of those things were like, coming from an exercise and athletic background, or like, okay, movement, nutrition, these things. So I started getting into a little bit more like nutrition, learning about how different foods can contribute to or potentially reduce inflammation. And so, of course, I removed like a ton of things from my diet. And as I did this through trial and error, I found that I was very reactive and sensitive to a lot of things. I developed a lot of chemical sensitivities, food sensitivities, in addition to those light and sound sensitivities. So for the time being, it did seem to help with that reactivity to remove things like gluten and sugar and caffeine and nightshades. And there was a lot of specific things that seemed to be triggers for me. So I saw that as kind of low-hanging fruit, like, okay, let's get some of these things out of the way. And body started to become a little bit less reactive. Didn't solve the problem, but it felt like a step in the right direction. Then, I kind of had that seed planted that I mentioned before from working with these, injured patients who were coming back from neurological injuries, and realized that, okay, there's this. There has to be this sort of other component. Of course we have to take care of the body, but there seems to be something else going on here. And one of the things that, actually, I would love to share this with your community if I can find it. I'm sure I can. I remember I wrote this journal entry where I really tried to describe what it felt like to have these Lyme symptoms, because it was so different from anything I had ever experienced before. And it was something that I've heard other Lyme, people and Lyme patients, talk about, but it's basically there's this weird layer of perception where you kind of realize that how you're feeling in some way, the symptoms or certain things like pain or fibromyalgia have a perceptual component. Not to say they're not there. The experience is absolutely real. But I remember I described it like an avatar. I think I had just seen that movie, and I described myself feeling like I'm not me. I am sort of like this puppet master behind my body. And the weird thing that I noticed was that even in the midst of all of this fatigue and under all these symptoms, in certain instances and in certain times, I could still manufacture the strength to say, get up and walk into the kitchen, but maybe I'd have to recover for 4 days from that, And so the perceptual thing that I'm talking about is that it feels like I have zero strength. It feels like I have just, full pain. But if I actually go to try and produce some level of force, okay, it's like that, it's there. My body can do that. But there's a huge cost to it. It takes like 100 times more energy out of me, than it would previously. So that was a weird kind of thing. And in exercise, physiology, one of the things I remembered studying was this phenomenon of the effects of sleep deprivation on training. Something that a lot of athletes face. And just to give you an example, and we'll kind of relate this back to the Lyme experience. If you were to say, pull an all-nighter and then go back into the gym, you would probably be able to lift less than 50%, maybe far less than 50% of your normal, load. Now, the reason for that is not because your body suddenly lost 50% of its muscle mass. It's because your brain doesn't have the metabolites required to sufficiently recruit the muscle fibers needed to produce that force. So there is this brain level of activity that the brain is the driver of our movement, of our heartbeat, of a lot of different systems in the body. And so anyway, all this to say, this kind of prompted or reopened that curiosity of like, I think there's something to be said for the brain playing a role here. And that led me into listening to some of these podcasts and going down the rabbit hole of neuroplasticity, which had been already, very successfully applied to stroke victims and people with lost limbs and things we can get into there, like chronic pain.
Ben, I want to interrupt there because I think there's several key points I just want to focus on. And absolutely, there is a connection between the brain and the physical body that you described in the exercise community that we see in the chronic Lyme community. And we're going to get into that and Reorigin and all the great work you've done to give back to the community now that you're through your journey. But I also want to focus back on where you were in your journey at that point, right? Because you were at a place where you found little things that were helping you, when you avoided nightshades that were creating inflammation, when you would, these little hacks, we'll call them. But I think it all comes back to what you described at the beginning of this podcast, where you said, we have this self-perpetuating inflammatory condition with chronic Lyme disease. And you were fighting that, right, at that point in your healing journey. And you were finding little hacks and tricks and tips to overcome that, but they weren't sustainable. They weren't something that were getting you through to stay beyond that threshold. And you were sort of struggling. But I do want to also highlight some factual pieces before we move on with your journey, because especially being here on Long Island, right, in New York, where Lyme is so prevalent, what doctors did you see, whether it was on Long Island, New York City, Connecticut, et cetera, that finally helped you get a diagnosis and began your care plan with treatment? Because many people are looking to seek out a good doctor to help them begin their journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the doctors that had a really great, influence on me was Dr. Morrison and Jerry at the Morrison Center. Others were Dr. Manganaro and Dr. Schultz at what at the time was Manhattan Advanced Medicine. This kind of, was an eye-opening experience. I remember, I think it was Dr. Morrison who said something that really gave me a lot of hope. He said, no medicine, whether pharmaceutical or supplement, will ever be as powerful as your body's own immune system, right? And so that kind of led me down the rabbit hole of biological medicine and tuning into all these lectures with Dr. Rao, and eventually going to a lecture in Marion Institute in Massachusetts, to learn about this idea of biological medicine. And basically a lot of these concepts have worked their way into, the formation of the Reorigin program. But the basic tenet is that the body really is a self-healing system. We know that if we get a cut on our hand, it heals, provided that the environment is correct, that the wound is cleaned and cared for. But the care that we do isn't the thing that is healing the wound. It is the body itself that has that innate capacity to self-heal. And I think it was Dr. Schultz, told me another thing that was, inspiring. His philosophy around, being a medical practitioner, he said, it's not about perpetually managing sick patients. It's about reestablishing or restoring their own ability to self-manage and to self-heal. And little gems of wisdom like that came my way were so hopeful to me, because they said that your body can heal. Your body does heal. That is what the body does. So then, of course, the question arises, well, if the body is self-healing, then why am I stuck? What is this self-perpetuating loop, that I'm stuck in? Yeah.
Ben, before we go on with that, I just want to focus on, again, where you are, right? Because you're seeing some of the top doctors in New York City. Dr. Morrison in the Morrison Center is a very popular Lyme treatment center. You're seeing a lot of other really good Lyme doctors. You treat with oral antibiotics, doxycycline, amoxicillin, IV Rocephin. So you're getting hardcore IV antibiotics. You're getting IV detox aids and nutrients. You're doing alternative therapies, and you make some progress, but you're still not where you want to be. You're crashing. You're doing a little bit better. You're crashing, and you're going through that pattern of just ups and downs, right? So at this point is, I think, the pivotal point where you're starting to absorb all this information about the body's innate ability to heal, the immune system, and you're starting to now seek out these lecturers to go and learn more about that, to pivot where you are in your healing journey to try something else, right? And that's kind of where we are right now. So you're in your mid-20s. You should be at, the peak of your life, but yet you are struggling just to survive and function in everyday life, right? Is that where we are right now?
Exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's walk through the transition, because, I guess before we walk through the transition, just give us an idea for our listeners. How much did the oral antibiotics and the IV antibiotics help you? Because you said you built this permanent indentation in your mother's couch, right? So you were pretty much couch bound. How much did we'll say, traditional medicine through the Morrison Center, et cetera, help you heal? So give us an idea of where you were before treatment, and where you were at before this treatment, before you went on to start studying brain rewiring and neuroplasticity.
Yeah. So I'll just say that if I think of my journey, I'll actually, think of it in there were three kind of phases to it. The first one I would call conventional. And that was really the bulk of where I was doing a lot of the antibiotics. The second phase I would call biological medicine. That's where I was getting into more of the natural stuff with Dr. Morrison and Manganaro. And then the third phase is more of the neuroplasticity. So going back to your question, the antibiotic route, the more conventional route, I did not get any relief from that. Everyone is different. I know many people for which, IV Rocephin worked. It did the trick, so to speak. That was not the case for me at all. Sometimes when switching to a new antibiotic, I would experience temporary relief. As I learned, antibiotics have an anti-inflammatory property. And if you can reduce even temporarily inflammation, you can, keep symptoms at bay. But ultimately, my experience was that I would get worse after each round, and it was like coming down another rung of the ladder. And so again, everyone has a unique, journey and experience. But for me, once I started to really get into this biological medicine mindset and understand the body as the self-healing mechanism, and the game there becomes very much about improving the body's in what they call the internal milieu, or improving.
What's milieu? Can you say that again and describe that term?
Yeah, the milieu we can think of as the body's internal environment. So this includes things like the gut microbiome, but it also includes like things like tissue pH in the interstitial tissue and the cells, everything within the body. We know that we have a certain environment, and in European biological medicine, they have a really interesting model, which I don't think has made its way into Western medicine really at all. They call it reactional modes. And one of the things they evaluate in patients is a person's reactional mode. And it's basically like a level of reactivity and also an ability for the system to detoxify itself, which is a huge, huge component of healing. And just to give you, kind of an example of what these reactional modes are, there are 4 of them, reactional modes 1 through 4. And so by analogy, someone who's like in a reactional mode 1 would be like someone who can go party all night, drink, get 2 hours of sleep, wake up the next day and be fine. That would be like a reactional mode 1. Their body is very good at releasing toxicity, processing things, and recovering quickly. Someone like where I was, who was in like a reactional mode 4, by analogy, would be like if you take 1 sip of wine and you're hungover for 3 days, right? So it isn't just, here's the key takeaway that came to me, is that there's 2 sides of the coin. There's what happens to you, or there's what you're exposed to, and then there's how and why your body responds. And that is determined largely by this type of reactional mode, and that level of reactivity, or how or why your body will respond, is largely determined by the brain, which is the chief governing vessel that presides over all of these organs and cells and systems, including the kidneys, the lymphatic system, and the liver, and all of the detox mechanisms.
Ben, before we get there, because now we have 3 phases to your journey, right? We have the conventional, we have the biological, and then we have the brain. So we understand the conventional, and that the traditional antibiotics didn't really work well for you in your experience. Now we're on the biological side. Before we get into the brain side of your healing journey, can you give us some more specific details, biologically speaking, what you were doing with Dr. Morrison and these other alternative practitioners to treat with biological medicine, like some treatments, whether they're herbal, natural, et cetera, so our listeners can know exactly what you did, and then also tell us how they worked for you personally?
Yeah, sure. So the biological medicine approach is kind of looking at where does the lightest touch have the greatest impact. Again, the fundamental principle is to reestablish your body's self-healing systems. And like Dr. Morrison said, nothing will ultimately be as powerful or potent as your body's own immune system. So the whole idea is like, rather than seeing the doctor or seeing yourself as the one doing the healing, your role becomes almost like a gardener. You are there to plant the seeds, to create the best conditions, to nurture the plants, and then allow the body to do its thing, to self-heal. So what does that look like from a practical standpoint? There was some detoxification involved, starting with just some supplements. We can get into specifics, but I will say, I certainly, after giving my TED talk, I got a ton of questions on social media about like, what was the thing you did? How many milligrams of vitamin C was it? And I'm always happy to share, the specifics and answer those questions. But I would just like to caveat it with that every person is very unique, and what's right for one person might not be right for another. So however many milligrams of vitamin C helped my system achieve, homeostasis or whatnot, might not be the right call for somebody else. But basically, when it comes to like the biological medicine intervention, there was the first and foremost was nutritional medicine. So, continuing down that road of, for the time, removing the things that were challenging my system. There was I read Dr. Rao's book, The Swiss Secret to Optimal Health. Dr. Morrison was, I think, very much aligned with that nutritional medical approach as well, with the addition of a little more protein. But basically, it's a lot of, steamed vegetables, a lot of, just healthy organic foods, starting the day with lemon juice and water, things that can help to cleanse the system, removing things like caffeine, of course, which can cause the body to sort of clamp down and ramp up into this more sympathetic dominant phase. So a lot of the biological medicine approach has to do with calming the nervous system, and doing that by removing the things that are challenging you. Those can be foods. Those can be, if light and sound are challenging you for the time. For me, putting the garbage bags over the windows and silencing the phones, like that was what I needed for the time. It's basically getting your body into this state where it can calm down, become less reactive, and then additionally supporting it with some additional nutrients. And those things are pretty run of the mill. Like in my case, I was on like a couple multivitamins, some fish oil, a few basic supplements. There was nothing really too fancy going on there. I think occasionally at Morrison Center, I did some of the IV, B vitamins and stuff, but found that the impacts of that relatively fleeting. It's much more about the long-term, building a supporting healthy internal milieu.
Ben, on that note, so for sure, and I personally, and most people that come on this podcast learn and benefit from, a high protein diet, low carbs, low gluten, low sugar, low dairy, right? Those things we avoid foods that are inflammatory. We take on foods that enrich our body with nutrients. And those are really powerful tools. These are all great things you're sharing with us. But as you got feedback from your TEDx talk, and we're going to get feedback from this podcast, I just know what people are going to ask us at the end of this, right? So if we just get a little bit deeper about whatever you recall off the top of mind, what specifically from a vitamin standpoint and an herbal standpoint and a supplement standpoint, you don't have to give doses, but just what things were you on? And then, our listeners can then take that to their practitioners and, potentially look at that for themselves as well. If you have that at the top of mind, not to put you on the spot or anything, but our listeners very much like to get into the weeds and know exactly what you did at that phase to see if it can be applicable in their healing journey.
Yeah, sure. So, like I mentioned, vitamin C, multivitamin, fish oil were kind of fundamentals. Another one when it comes to detoxification was spagyric medicine. This is a realm of medicine that's well known in Germany and other parts of Europe, not very well known in the States. There was a company at the time, Saluna, that I actually ended up working for in some capacity because I found them so interesting, that had a line of spagyric remedies. Spagyric is basically a form of plant medicine that it combines the effects of homeopathy with actual plant matter. So it's kind of like a combination of an herbal combined with a homeopathic. And the idea, and what I kind of liked about these supplements, if we're to call them that, is that they are not really aimed at pushing your body to do one thing or the other, but instead to kind of like restore the function of the organs of elimination. So in this case, I would take 3 different remedies. I think they were called Renalin, Hepatic, and Aquavit. It's been a while, but those were the 3. And again, I'm not sure if those are still available in the States or not. But there are other forms of spagyric medicine that can essentially help to, as I understand it, rather than like upregulate the organs of elimination. Whenever I hear like upregulate or downregulate, I always think, I'm not so sure about this, because it means that, is that going to lead to a rebound effect when I stop taking this? The thing about spagyrics, again, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert in supplementation or this field, is that they kind of support your organs to come back online and do what they normally do, so that you don't need to keep on taking it forever. So I think I was cycling on and off of that for maybe 6 to 12 months, and that seemed to be helpful. Again, I also did do some IV infusions in the realm of detoxification, and all of these things, in my experience, although certainly not directly, more over time, did seem to serve to start to lighten and reduce that total allostatic load that was putting pressure on the system. I say not, immediately, because oftentimes I would get worse before I would get better. You change one thing, you add one thing to the mix or tweak something, and it seemed to have all these other, downstream effects. But the long-term trend after about 12 months of this biological medicine type treatment is that I felt like I had more wiggle room. I felt like I had more, more breathing room. Still, I will say it felt like I was carrying lead weights. And on those days when I could push myself to the top, as soon as I stopped pushing or struggling or exerting effort, it was like those lead weights would just drag me right back down to where I was before. Granted, that baseline was a new baseline. It was higher than where I initially was at when I was doing all the antibiotics. It wasn't nearly, where I needed to be.
Right, but you were no longer stuck, in this mold of your body and your mother's couch, but you were still not where you wanted to be health-wise. And thank you for going to those details, because again, people listening are looking for clues and tips and tricks. And I just want to, repeat and spell, because a lot of people are like, what does that mean, spagyric, right? So, and I'm probably saying it the wrong way, but it's SPAGYRIC medicine. And
Correct.
here, just again, for our listeners, it's a European biological medicine modality that incorporates homeopathy, herbs, and essentially pharmacology as well. So it kind of blends all these things together. And this is a huge, huge modality used at New York Center for Innovative Medicine, which is right here on Long Island. And we've, had a lot of people on this podcast have great success using spagyric medicine at New York Center for Innovative Medicine. And, to kind of recap what you said, they label it as being more effective, less toxic, more bioavailable, more concentrated, more dynamic, and more importantly, more gentle. So it doesn't spin your body into this overdrive to flare up and get even worse, right? So, but I think now this is a really important segue, because your conventional medicine for you just did not work. Your biological medicine helped you, but you were still not where you wanted to be. And now here we are, you finally start to realize the importance of the brain. And we're transitioning to that brain side, right? The neuroplasticity side of your healing journey. So now if we can, Ben, let's geek out over the brain. Let's geek out about what you learned and transition this into, your development of reorigin, because this is a really fun part of your story where I know Rich and I are going to want to jump in together. I can see Rich is already eager on the edge of his chair to jump in and chat as well.
So Ben, before we go there, I do want to make sure that we don't suffer from recency bias here with the description of your journey, right? Because in many cases, what we have is people who are set up by the medical industrial complex to believe one pill, one solution, right? Mm-hmm. And then what we often have is people on this podcast saying, well, I was ultimately able to overcome my symptoms because of X, but it really is the last thing they did, rather than looking at the entire journey together. So just so that we don't suffer from that recency bias, do you believe that there were benefits to each of these steps that ultimately allowed you to get to the point where now dealing with the brain rewiring issue and the neuroplasticity allowed you to heal, but there was some benefit to the first step in your journey? There was additional steps to the second step in your journey, and then you were able to build on those steps, but without having those earlier foundational steps, your successes with the rewiring may not have been successful, so that people don't think, hey, well, I just don't need to see my doctor anymore. I don't need to deal with herbals. What I just need to do is brain rewire and deal with the neuroplasticity, and I'm going to get better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really, really good point. And these are all different pieces of the puzzle. We have a brain, we have a nervous system, but we also have a physical body, and we have to treat all of these aspects of ourselves. And so just going back to the three phases, and to answer your question, I'd say from the first phase, the main benefit was education. I can honestly say I don't think that it didn't feel like it moved the needle in a positive healing direction for me with the conventional and the antibiotics. That was just my experience.
Do you think it's possible? Let me stop you there. Do you think it's possible that reducing the microbe load with all the antibiotics that you were taking was an important step, so that you can then take a second step that would allow you to deal with the terrain issue, right? Because one of the things that we also see on this podcast is this bias that it's either a find or kill, or it is a terrain issue. And quite frankly, I believe it's both. And I think both of our all of our podcast guests collectively would probably, bring us to that point again. And that's an age-old battle, right? I mean, we know that at the time that germ theory was being developed, there was a terrain theory being developed at the same time by two great friends, right? And Matt and I are going to be writing a series of blog posts on old dead scientists, and we're going to deal with some of that. But it's both, right? I mean, it is microbial, right? And your barrel being overwhelmed, as you had described so well before. And it was also your terrain, or the barrel that you were holding it in, was also vulnerable. In part, we're going to get to the brain piece, but your terrain was not able to manage all these microbes. So between the first step, which was you were on that kill phase, and the second step, which was the terrain phase, and then got you to the point where you could now be healthy enough to start to discover the basic human superpower of neuroplasticity.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the syntax is really important here, and we can't. One of the challenging things with Lyme disease is we can't really know how effective a thing is like antibiotics from a bacterial load perspective. We can't really measure anything we're measuring insofar as, Lyme testing is our body's reaction to Lyme. It's antibodies. We're not able to directly detect the total load. So we don't know if the antibiotics did reduce the load or sent it into biofilms or L forms or all these other things, just from my experience in that phase of the journey, it's very possible it could have set up for future, success in some way. So I don't want to discount that possibility. That isn't how it felt at the time. I think the biological medicine stuff really did help and make a lot of sense. And you hit something really interesting that was a pivotal point for my mindset too. And I remember a really big sort of question I asked when I thought about this is that, okay, we'll call it the conventional approach, which says that the pathogen is everything. Kill the pathogen and all the problems will go away. All right. So that's one paradigm. The other paradigm is we'll call it the biological medicine approach, which says that the pathogen is nothing. Just fix the terrain and the body will take care of itself, including kick out the pathogens. I kind of looked at this and said, well, is there a middle ground? Can we do both? And in fact, there are some people that are doing both. And at the time, Manhattan Advanced Medicine, Dr. Manganaro, which is now the New York Center for Innovative Medicine, has been associated with them, is kind of taking that approach where they are in a certain syntax, sort of setting the body up for success using biological medicine. Again, pretty light touch stuff. And then doing some forms of antimicrobials and things like that, but not in the realm of antibiotics, using more natural therapies. And then, continuing with detoxification. And so that is something that I found from like that total load perspective did have a big impact. Again, we are brains, but we're physical bodies. And so reducing a lot of that load, whether it was actually reducing the pathogen or just reducing toxicity levels in the body that gave me more resilience and helped my immune system to more effectively fight the pathogen. We will never really know exactly how it was, what was going on, but absolutely, I did find that to be a substantial rung of the pyramid that allowed me to settle on a new baseline.
So, and it is important, so that we're transparent here with our listeners, is that, everyone wants a quick solution, but there is no quick solution to a chronic illness. There just simply isn't. There are solutions and there is a journey, and you've outlined that journey for us. But unfortunately, again, I'll go back to the recency bias argument. Each phase of this journey is an important phase of the journey, and you have to build upon each step in order to be able to get to a place where you're successful. But the piece, of course, that seems to be most neglected in the Lyme community is, of course, the brain piece, right? And the question always is, when do we bring that brain piece in? Because we've had podcast guests in the past. For example, Dorothy Leland from LymeDisease.org shared with us that when her daughter went on her journey, she remained symptomatic until she went through a brain retraining process, right? I mean, that was a necessary piece. So we've had that on our radar for a long time. And when we've talked with other guests about this and about introducing this rewiring piece into their journey earlier rather than later, right? Rather than as a rehabilitation piece, but maybe as a prehabilitation piece. The reaction that we've gotten from our guests, and Ashley Marber, for example, Ashley Bellinger, I'm messing up our Ashleys, had said, Rich, I was so sick, I couldn't have done it. I just couldn't do any retraining when I was that sick. So give me your reaction to that, and then let's talk about the brain and the role it plays in healing.
Yeah. So, first, I think there's many, many, many different roads to healing, not just one. And that involves, different sort of syntax. Also, it's very easy for all of us, to anyone, to fall into a kind of binary mindset of like, do this or not do this, not realizing that there are different shades of things, there are different levels or extents to which you can do something.
Well, for sure, every single healing plan has to be an individualized healing plan. I absolutely agree with that. But there are some models that other people have used successfully to heal, and when those models are available to each one of us, we can then use those models to build our individualized treatment plan, right? Because one of the things you shared with us was that you were really hurt when you interacted with the medical community and you believed that they had the capacity to heal you and that they would have models to heal you, and they didn't, right? Because we get set up by the industrial medical system to believe that they can heal us when they can't, right? I mean, our body heals itself. And what we have to be trained to do, or what we have to be assisted in doing, is your language was to reestablish the self-healing system. And if we're going to establish a self-healing system, that what we should be doing is working with medical professionals who are not going to take a position that they're going to be our heroes and heal us, but they're going to help us to learn what models will be available to us, and then we'll get feedback from our system about whether or not we are in fact reestablishing the healing system.
Yeah, very true.
All right, so let's take the next step, right? So Matt and I have been, talking with you for a long time, but we needed to lay that foundation to properly get to this point now, because we didn't want this to be TED Talk Point 2.0. We wanted to really dig in and give people the foundation for where you are. And now you get to this point now where you discover the superpower that we all have, right? Now, this is something we all have. This is not an individualized piece, which we were just talking about a moment ago for healing. Everyone has this superpower, and everyone should be using this on their healing journey, unless you disagree with that.
No, I have to say I fully agree with that. We have this power, this tool at our disposal, and I think we can use it, and I think we can introduce it in different ways at different times. And I can certainly share how I introduced it to myself, or what my inroad was.
Please do that, because we do want to talk about when on the journey these tools should be introduced. So talk about how you introduced it into your journey, and then let's talk about whether or not there were other opportunities for you had you been aware of this at an earlier stage in your journey.
Yeah. Okay. So going back to the definition of neuroplasticity, again, neuroplasticity is just the brain's natural ability to change its structure and function. And the reason this is so important when it comes to health, and specifically to chronic or any sort of self-perpetuating condition, is that the brain plays a key role in regulating a whole host of bodily functions. And so if we can kind of intentionally, in a way, signal or condition the brain to operate in a different way, it can kind of filter down and have far-reaching effects into other parts of the body. So that being said, most of the time, actually, let me back up for 1 second. Now, the way that I'm going to talk about neuroplasticity is a little bit different. It's more in the realm of an action, something that you can do. It's the intentional action of consciously changing your brain function. Most of the time, our brains are changing pretty constantly without us knowing. Anytime we learn a new skill, you see someone and you memorize a new face, your brain has changed and created new neural pathways associated with that pattern, whether a movement pattern or a visual pattern. So neuroplasticity is always happening. But what we're going to talk about here is intentionally directing that neuroplasticity to happen in a very specific way.
Okay, but before we get there, we have to talk about why we need to do that, and how, as adaptive beings, right? I mean, we are the apex predators on the earth. We are the dominant species because we're the most adaptive species, right? And that's actually what Charles Darwin said. Not that we're the survival of the fittest, which is not attributed, it should not be attributed to Charles Darwin, because that was actually one of his students. He said that we are the apex predators because we are the most adaptive species, right? So we are adaptive, right? We can change. Our brain can change on a regular basis. But before you get to the piece of intentionally changing your brain, I think we have to talk about why you need to intentionally change your brain. Because this elegant microbe that is, or these series of microbes that are affecting us and making us chronically ill, are also changing us during the acute phase of our illness. Our adaptive brain is actually adapting in response to the acute phase of the illness, and it's actually now wiring us to be sick, right? And that's what was happening with you. So before you get to intentionally changing it, talk about how it was changed unintentionally by the illness and why you then need to make that change. I want you to make that piece. I want you to define that piece first.
Yeah, sure. That's a really good point. So as you mentioned, we have evolved to do really one thing really well, which is survive. And the brain's first order of business is to ensure our survival. Its second order of business is efficiency. It wants to expend as little energy as possible. And the way that it does that is by creating associations. We can call this, think of this as like shortcuts, exactly, short codes, right? So if you think about walking is a great example. Walking is a very, very complex movement pattern that involves, hundreds of micro motions. If we know that it took a period of time for us to learn how to walk. For some of us, it takes, a few months to a few years, but it takes time because the brain is modulating and adapting and wiring in this very complex movement pattern. But once it is wired in, fortunately, we don't have to think about flexing the calf muscle and then the hamstring and then the quad and then raising the ankle and all of these sequences. The brain just automatically deploys the walking pattern, right? And that is a result of neuroplasticity and that second order of business, which is efficiency.
Okay, so let's go. Let's stay with the efficiency piece, and let's talk about how you identified that your brain efficiency was being affected during this journey, right? Because you gave the example in your TED Talk, and this is what I thought about when you were giving your TED Talk is that your brain over time had created these shortcuts to identify what a shoe was, right? Shoes could be sneakers, shoe could be clogs, shoe could be it could be a lot of different things, right? And that was a shortcut that your brain now could no longer utilize because your brain was being affected, and the shortcuts that your brain had identified for shoes or doorknobs or any of these other things were now being affected, right?
Exactly right. And that's a really good point, because in the brain's infinite wisdom, there is a hierarchy, right? Going back to that first point of survival being the number one thing, the hierarchy stems from there. So one of the associations that the brain can make is the association between a pathogen or an active infection, or even infection that could be no longer active, and in what it deems as an appropriate immune response, right? That is probably one of the most important associations. Pathogen comes in, the body responds, and we want it to respond that way. We want that. People think of inflammation as bad, but inflammation is good. In the acute phase, inflammation is what catalyzes the healing response. And so we want that immune, activation. We want that inflammation because that's ultimately what can help to, attack the pathogen or heal the wound. Now, the challenge is when that immune activation and that threat activation stays active for longer than that acute phase. And at that point, because the body is a relatively finite system of resources, the brain now starts preferentially shutting down what it deems as these secondary functions or secondary resources, even things like, digestion and wound healing and, hormones and chemicals needed for procreation. Those will take a far back seat to what it sees as the more immediate threat to your survival, which is this fighting off this infection. And similarly, it will also break or deprioritize certain cognitive connections. It's not important to know what your shoes are for. It's not important to know how to use a doorknob when your life is at stake in that moment. Here's where the challenge lies. There's a misclassification that can happen where the brain has, because it is so wired up for survival and it is so primed to identify things as threats so that it can deploy that defensive mechanism, it can sometimes get it wrong. And it can sometimes classify, or I should say misclassify, things that are challenging to the system, unpleasant, undesired for sure, but not immediately life-threatening. It can classify those as life-threatening and set off that whole biochemical and hormonal cascade that, again, draws all of these resources away from other longer-term healing and maintenance functions of the body.
So it's stuck fighting, even though the fight should be over.
Correct.
All right. So now let's talk about one more piece, and then I want you to talk about your program, and that is that we do have a binary brain, right? We have the sympathetic and parasympathetic state. And what is going to be happening, and again, you describe our brain as this organ that is resource dependent. Our brain uses more resources than any other brain in any other species on Earth, right? And because it uses so much resources, it has to find efficiencies. And you describe them as, or I describe them as shortcuts, and you accepted my definition, right? So we have that piece. We have this binary brain. Right now, our brain gets triggered into fight or flight. Right, we're in the sympathetic nervous state, and now we're stuck in the sympathetic nervous state. Right, we can't get out of that state, and as a result of not being out of that state, we now have all this inflammation. Right, and because we have all this inflammation, our body is now symptomatic, even though the microbes may not still be alive.
They might not be alive, but they might be alive too. And this is where something like Lyme disease is so challenging, because going back to that concept of the immune system being the most powerful thing, what enables the immune system to be powerful is immune modulation. It's not pressing the foot on the gas and constant generation of inflammatory processes, because that, we know, wears down other systems. It wears down the adrenal glands. It burns out metabolites in the brain. It leaves us feeling depleted, anxious, depressed. And it also can ramp up systemic inflammation in the body, which can change tissue pH. And going back to that concept of the internal milieu, it basically creates an environment that is more acidic and more hospitable to pathogens to persist. So here we have a really classic vicious cycle whereby, your brain, and particularly the section of the brain called the limbic system, which is the threat detection and response, mechanism, with the very best of intentions, is stepping on the gas, is, producing all this inflammation, trying to help you, trying to kick out the pathogen. But then what happens is the body gets sort of stuck reacting to its own reactions. The brain processes the symptoms themselves as further threats and mounts more of that immune response to fight off those symptoms. And so this just keeps on going, and that leads to the fatigue, the burnout, the utilization of all these vital resources, and paradoxically leaves our body and our immune system in a state where it's not optimized to actually fight the pathogen. And so we do end up with a sort of position where we are more susceptible now to either persisting pathogenic infections or even secondary infections, colds and flus, to come on. And I remember when I was going through Lyme, I would constantly get sick with additional colds and flus and things like that, because in a way the defense systems were worn out.
Ben, can you just want to jump in here, because I think this is an important topic, because I myself, after getting treatment, I was sick every couple of months and just bedbound for a week, right? And then and nobody around me was getting as sick as I was. And I think the connection that I didn't understand back then is our brains and our nervous systems are creating a more acidic environment in our bodies, and therefore making our bodies more hospitable to illness and reinfection and other things that are just more opportunistic as well, Ben, right? Is that what you're saying here? And now with brain rewiring, we can really reset that and alter that so we're no longer stuck in this state, and we can go back to the way we were before being chronically ill. I'm trying to oversimplify it, but I think it's an important note for listeners to understand, because it's a complex topic that we need to really implement in our lives to have sustainable health.
Yeah, exactly. Very close. So it's being in that chronic elevated state, that chronic fight or flight or sympathetic dominant state, that changes the internal milieu, changes tissue pH, inhibits natural detox functions, and creates this, internal state of tension and buildup of toxins, which again is unfortunately hospitable or more hospitable to these opportunistic pathogens.
All right, so we now agree that the adaptive nature of our brain or the neuroplasticity has been used against us by the microbes, right? And you're now arguing that you've come up with a tool that will allow you to take control of your neuroplasticity and change what has been changed, what has been negatively changed by the disease.
Yeah, so I'd say I haven't come up with the tool. The tool has actually been hiding in plain sight for decades. There's research going back to the 60s and early 1970s. I think it was 1971. Seminal paper came out called Conditioned Immunosuppression, where they had done experiments, giving rats injections of, I think it was E. coli virus, combined with a dextrose solution, sugar water. They did this many times, through the acquisition phase to see what impact that would have. And then, after some time, they would just give them the dextrose solution with no traces of the pathogen. And they found that they would still have the same immune reaction. So they've known since the 60s and 70s that there is this learned component to infections. And a lot of this research came back to light last year in a paper that was published in Scientific American called "The Brain Has a Special Kind of Memory for Past Infections." So there is this sort of, triggering, and there's a lot of research, supporting that. I think what's more recent is developing a set of protocols and tools that can help us interject. And again, a lot of these existed and were being applied successfully in other arenas. When we talk about self-directed neuroplasticity, we're kind of getting in and actively changing these patterns. One of the first applications for that was stroke victims, was regaining the use of limbs that the brain had lost connection with. Another one was chronic pain, where they realized that there is this perceptual component to it, and they kind of make this distinction between what they call peripheral pathology, which is an indication of some message that your brain is getting as a result of some actual damage or change in your body, versus what's known as central sensitization, which is basically an increased level of sensitivity in the neurons taking signals from certain areas of the body. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for this conditioning effect that takes place, but the key takeaway here is that the brain effectively is always learning in that aid to, number one, protect you, and number two, create these shortcuts. It makes associations. And when it learns that a certain symptom that maybe initially was triggered by a pathogen, but can persist beyond the pathogen, when a certain symptom has been associated with stress or danger, that symptom alone can produce the inflammatory impact that in a roundabout way causes that symptom.
Right. So the memory of the contact with the microbe results in an inflammatory response, which then creates a terrain which makes it more likely that you're going to suffer a reinfection or a relapse, all just based on the memory or the shortcut that had been built in the brain based on the prior experience.
Exactly right.
So you were kind enough to say that you did not come up with the solution, but it was hiding in plain sight. But you did start to use the solution for your health, and you're now trying to share that with the rest of the Lyme community and the chronic community generally. Mm-hmm. So talk to us about what you discovered about rewiring and how that helped you on your journey. Yeah.
So for me, it started with a pretty profound experience I had, and this became the title of my TED Talk. It's One Deep Breath. This was in a time where I was at a pretty low point in my healing. I had undergone biological medicine, made some progress, but was in that state where I was still feeling very much stuck. Every time I tried to push forward, I would be met with an equal and opposite force in the opposite direction that seemed to, exacerbate symptoms, trigger all that fatigue, and basically land me back on the couch. So in this state, I remember an actual certain instance where things were just becoming all too much. The physical symptoms, the fatigue was there. It started to spin up into this narrative, this story in my mind about how I'll never move forward. It had already been 2.5 years at this point, trying everything I could think to try. And it was like it felt like a full-on panic attack, physical, mental, emotional symptoms, just absolute panic. And I like to think that it was some higher wisdom or some part of me, maybe one neuron that had some higher intelligence, prompted my body to do maybe the only thing that I really could do in that moment, which was to just take one deep breath. And I let out this big kind of sigh of relief. And then right on the other side of that sigh was something that I hadn't experienced for years, maybe not even in my whole life. It was this little microsecond of like total peace, of total lack of resistance is the best way to frame it. For the first time, I wasn't pushing against anything. It was just, it felt like the tight, restrictive t-shirt that I had been wearing had just suddenly loosened into this giant blouse, and I was just there. And as quickly as it came, it passed. But what remained was the awareness that was there. And so I was like, okay, that's interesting. I wonder if I can get back there again. What did I do to get there the first time? Well, I took this like deep breath and let out this big physiologic sigh. So I did it again and it didn't work. I gave it some time and I did it again and it didn't work. And, a couple times more, and I tried it again and then it did work. And so I realized that there was this thing that it's not like I could hit the bullseye every time, but every once in a while, there it is. I would find that little pocket and I would just savor that pocket. And so, as I mentioned in my talk, like that became my only goal. That became the only thing I felt I could control. I can't control whether today is the day that I can walk into the kitchen or not, whether today is the day that I recognize my shoes or not. I think I can, if I remind myself, I can control this. I can take one deep breath. I can't guarantee what's going to happen on the other side of that, but I can just do this action no matter what. And that's what I did. And
okay, so let's deconstruct that one breath and the impact that it had on the Olympic system and the impact that it was having on calming your amygdala and ultimately causing you to have a moment where you were out of the sympathetic state and you were in the parasympathetic state.
Right.
And you now realize that there were tools that could be available to you that could take you out of fight or flight, put you in rest and digest, and that would not only take you out of the suffering that you're in, but perhaps put you in a position where you could get into a healing state.
Yeah. And thanks for breaking it down that way, because that is really at the crux of it, and something that I didn't realize I was doing or was happening at the time. But in retrospect, as I started to learn more of this, basically that one deep breath was serving as a pattern interrupt. It was serving to break this perpetual loop that was keeping me in chronic fight or flight. And as I'm sure you've heard the quote by Viktor Frankl, between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space lies our freedom to choose a new response. Now, what Viktor Frankl doesn't include in that quote is that when you get in that space, to do it once is great, but to actually make a change such that your default state of being changes requires getting in that space repeatedly, repetition, over and over and over again, and continuously making that new choice to settle into that or drop into that, relaxed state right after.
So Ben, let's talk about that piece, because I think that's an important piece, and it's actually the way we define freedom on our Lyme Freedom Formula with Dr. Frankl's definition. So, when we talk about responsibility, we're talking about responding with ability, right? And what that really means is that space between an event and our response is when we have the ability to be free. And you discovered with that one breath that you had that space between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic space, and that you had the ability to have control of that. You could now respond with ability, right? And that's what you discovered with that one breath, despite not knowing what that one breath was at that moment. But the brilliance of that, of the way your brain was still able to work despite being so sick, and understanding that moment was freedom for you was the foundation of everything you've built since then.
Yeah, exactly. And so the more I practice this, the more consistently I could get myself there. If at first it happened once every, 1 out of 10 times, that was lucky. But the more I practice it, the more consistently I could get there. And the more I did that, the more I got there, the more I could widen that gap and sustain that. So what was a fraction of a second the first few times, eventually after a few days and few weeks became a full second, which when you haven't experienced a second of calm in years, that second is something really to be savored. Interestingly enough, and we can, caveat this or come back here. There's been a lot of research into savoring. Yale, the Science of Happiness or Science of Well-Being, their most popular course that they put online for free, goes deep into the neurobiology of savoring. And one of the Reorigin members recently asked, when I'm feeling good, is there anything I can do to capitalize off of that good feeling, to make that more enduring? And I said, absolutely. In a word, you can really savor it, because what you're doing effectively is you are establishing stronger neuronal connections with that peaceful place. So when you savor something, you're really, sending a lot of energy and intention down those neural pathways, and it actually thickens them. It creates wider, thicker, more functional pathways that are easier for those chemicals to travel down at a later time. So yeah, it was a process of just, okay, increase the frequency that I'm going to take this deep breath, and also increase the duration by getting in that gap and savoring that little bit of peace. And this is where the really interesting thing started to happen for me, is that the more I did that, the better I felt. I actually felt less reactive. Over time, I felt less symptomatic, because my body was not spending so much resources fighting its own symptoms and reactions. More energy started to come online and into the system. I had more available resources for cognition. I started thinking a little bit more clearly. So that brain fog started to subside. And this was not a linear process. This was not like a, onward and upward. This was, I absolutely had good days and I had really not good days, but it was a trend over time.
So talk to us about the course correcting that had to take place when you were on this journey of improving your ability to savor or celebrate, right? Because there are going to be things that are going to interfere with our ability to celebrate, or to, I'll use your term, to savor the successes that you're having, right? One of the things we often see in our community is that folks will then have some other issues that they have to deal with, right? And I'm wondering whether or not you had to deal with any feelings of whether or not you now deserved to have this freedom that you now had. And you did hint to us early on in this podcast that you had to work through some challenges that you had from your childhood. There had been some childhood issues that, and let's talk about that, how our childhood experiences, many before we're even 7 years old and cognitively aware of those experiences, now become shortcuts in our brain. And in many cases, those unhealthy shortcuts that are uploaded into our brain then interfere with our ability to go through the process of savoring or celebrating our successes, which then make it harder for us to have the myelin sheath thicken and become a more healthy neural pathway.
Oh yeah, 100%. You're speaking to my experience completely. I think the thing I noticed, and maybe it took me a while to consciously realize this, but that what would kick me out of that peaceful place, that place I could get to for a second, was what it would be immediately followed by, which is, I can't stay here. Like that's, and I don't know if it's partially coming from a place of, unworthiness but in some level it's beyond psychological. It really felt neurological, that my brain and body had just been conditioned to not allow myself to settle, right? That is something I remember most prominently, and took me a long time to decondition, is that even when I understand now mechanically what to do to get in that space between stimulus and response, and I understand from a neurobiological perspective that savoring is a good thing, and I know how to do that, there was this almost reflexive response that would kick me out of it. And that response was very much like, oh no, like we don't settle here. Like we visit here, but we don't actually stay here. And so, of course, to your point, like, yes, there's emotional components there. I have a friend who's on the tail end of recovery from long COVID now, and he said something really interesting to me the other day. He came to this realization just very recently. He said, "This is a medicine. You know, this COVID for me was a medicine." And I said, "Wow, that's an interesting perspective." And that's a perspective that took me a long time to get to with the Lyme, is that it is a guide in a lot of ways that can wreak havoc, and certainly does. And it can also at the same time illuminate things that were always there, right? That we're contributing to that allostatic load, that total load we mentioned in the beginning, that we're just waiting to be released or addressed or recognized in some way. And so, again, for me, it started with kind of what I think of as the low-hanging fruit. Like, okay, there's some nutritional patterns and habits and stress lifestyle patterns that, it's shown the spotlight on first, that these are the things you can and should change. And changing those, as I mentioned, like, created a little more buffer, a little more wiggle room, a little less reactivity. Then the next level comes in. Then there's the trauma responses, the tension, the stress that has built up over a lifetime of being human. We all have it. And there's been really interesting studies that have been, widely spoken about now, these ACE scores, adverse childhood experiences, where they've directly correlated the number or the extent to which people have experienced adverse childhood experiences. And they have a whole way of defining what those are, with the likelihood of coming down with a chronic illness or experiencing things like chronic pain and depression.
So Ben, let's stay there for a second and focus on that, because these adverse childhood experiences aren't necessarily the result of trauma that you've experienced yourself, although of course that would be an adverse childhood experience, but it could be experiences that your parents were having during your childhood, which then uploaded into your brain, even though they weren't particularly traumatic to you. So there could be situations where you suffered physical violence, or sometimes you could suffer emotional trauma, but there are times where there's just trauma around you. And certainly in this precognitive phase before 7 years old, they get uploaded as shortcuts into our brain, and they become unfortunately unhealthy loops that limit our ability to heal in many cases.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of rabbit holes to go down here, but we also know that there is, to a point you mentioned, there is this theory of acquired traits, which seems to be proving true the more they research it. And we know that stress patterns and cortisol can be transferred in utero to the fetus. A friend of mine actually founded an organization called Expectful that's aimed at helping pregnant mothers reduce the level of stress for that reason, to inhibit passing on those stressful states or high cortisol states to the fetus, to the child. And even, beyond that, stress patterns and reactive patterns. I mean, on some level, it's like, okay, there's a lot of science that's interesting and everything here. On an anecdotal level, it's sort of fairly obvious. Like, we know we get certain patterns from our parents. It's not that mysterious. And we know about epigenetics and how, things can get passed down and how things can change. To bring it back to a really hopeful place, we also know that we can have a tremendous amount of influence on our genetic expression. And, I've heard it said that roughly a third of the genes, are kind of set, and 2/3, that means are within our control, or 2/3 of the genetic expression are within our control. So we have a tremendous amount of control. And one of the things we have to acknowledge that we do not have control over is what our parents went through, or even what we went through as a child, or what infections we were exposed to.
We certainly don't have control over those experiences, but we have control over the way the shortcuts that are built into our brain that we use to either serve us or not serve us. And that's really what you're teaching, right? And that's what your course is designed to do, to help people not only identify these issues, right? And I agree with you that we don't want to lag and spend too much time talking about them, other than to identify that it is a part of the human experience. It's a part of the, of the terrain, or we use your term, milieu, that every one of us has, and just recognizing that it's a normal part of the human experience, and recognizing that is having an impact on our ability to either fight off the microbes in the first place, or on how we're going to respond after we do come in contact with the microbes, we have control. We are adaptive beings. We have neuroplasticity in our brain. We have epigenetic tools in our body, and I would take issue about whether or not it's 1/3, 2/3. I think it's substantially less than 1/3 of our genetic expression is coded with proteins. I think it's much less. So because we are such an adaptive machine, and because we have, as you had defined so I think eloquently, that space between an event and our response, we have superpowers that we can use to heal. And again, I agree with you that everyone's path has to be individualized, but one of the things that every one of us has is the ability to use our neuroplasticity and our epigenetics to heal. Do you agree?
I 100% agree. Yeah, we can absolutely strongly influence the changes that occur in our brain and body. And one thing I want to clarify here, because two things actually. One is that it's very easy initially, and I totally understand this myself because I was there when I started to learn this stuff. When we start to think about neuroplasticity and the brain, and even if you do some of this stuff and you start to get better or you experience some benefit from it, one of the first thoughts that can come up for a lot of people, definitely came up for me, is, wait a minute, if this stuff works, does that mean that this was in my head, right? Does that mean that it was that the psychiatrist was right and that it was depression or it was perception and it wasn't quote unquote real? Well, the reality is that the where this really breaks down is in our Cartesian dualism, separating the body from the brain. The body is the brain. The brain, through the central nervous system, literally unfolds itself into every aspect of the body. It touches the viscera, the internal organs, and it touches the skin. A good friend of mine who's an osteopath said that your physical body is like a touch screen, is how he described it. The brain is the central processor, but all of the senses, which are two-way streets, extend out to every organ, cell, and system in the body. So it is absolutely the case that this can be, I always say, it's not psychological, it's neurological. And these conditions are full brain-body conditions. What you're experiencing is real. The symptoms are absolutely real, and they exist in the body, and they are measurable, as they certainly were in my case, but they are also in part modulated and regulated by the brain. And this is where we have an immense amount of control. And there's more and more, exciting research, showing that we can actually modulate our own stress responses and what impacts that can have on the physical body.
So Ben, we talked about how we on this podcast and on our platform want to take control of terms because definitions matter. And you've corrected me on a number of different occasions during this podcast with the language that we've used and the definitions that we've used, right? But we have to take control of that thought process, which is it's all in your head. Because you know what? It is all in your head. And that's a good thing, because once we understand how our brain works, and you so eloquently defined that relationship between the brain and our body, then we are no longer offended by the reality of it really being all in our head, because it is all in our head. And the solution to the problem, at least in your case, was to understand that it was all in your head, to understand that you had control over what was happening in your head, and understand that because of the adaptive nature of your brain and your body, that you were able to use the freedom that Dr. Frankl had defined as a vehicle for healing.
Yeah, and I would just say that it starts and it ends in your head, right? When something is triggered by a certain brain pattern, it can produce, inflammation. It can produce real changes that are absolutely in the body. So not in the head, but actually in the body. But then the results of those changes, meaning the symptoms or the sensations that we experience, again, are perceived in the brain. So yes, it starts in your head, it ends in your head, but it loops into your body.
But it is all in your head, right? And we should own that term rather than having that term used as a way of gaslighting us. It's a term we should use to celebrate, right? I mean, we were using that as an issue, right? Because one of the things I remember Dr. Horowitz saying in one of the podcast interviews we did, he says, yeah, it's all in your head. You have bugs in your brain, right? And because you have bugs in your brain, you're going to necessarily have these changes that are taking place in your brain, right? So I want to talk to you about one last thing on this topic, and then I want to bring some observations in about my work with Matt, because I really love your perspective on Matt's healing journey. Because I've had the blessing of interviewing almost 350 people who've been on a Lyme disease journey and watched them heal. But at the same time, I've been on this journey with Matt Sabatella, right? And I've watched him heal, and I've watched him learn from, the people who've interviewed and watched him get better. And I'd like to get your perspective. Before I get there, though, I want to ask you about the 5 different ways our brain may be, and I just came up with these 5 based on doing some research on you and some of the work that you've done, right? So one of the things we talked about is that our our brain could make adaptive changes which are not going to serve us, meaning going to cause us to be sick if we have these precognitive uploads that are brought into our brain based on the human experience. And you actually pointed out that could happen in utero, right? So that's one way that our brain could be altered so that we will have these uploads that will not serve us. We talked about trauma, right? We could have traumatic experiences, both physical and emotional trauma, that could cause us to have these uploads, and again, triggering us into a sympathetic state. We could have microbes in our brain, and you actually showed in your TED Talk an image of your brain at one time and an image of your brain the second time, and you had those arrows on it, and you had lesions on your brain before, and then you didn't have lesions on your brain the second time, right? So you could have these bugs in your brain that literally attacking and eating your brain, which happened with you, right? We could also have environmental toxins that are in our brain, right? And we've learned about that from a number of our guests. Dr. Alan McDonald actually showed us slides with how dirty the Lyme bacteria is, and it's like spitting off all kinds of all kinds of junk and toxins, and they can get into our brains, right? So all of these things can be getting into our brains, and because we have this adaptive brain, this neuroplastic brain, when we're not in that space where we understand where our freedom is, the brain gets altered on us, and this really diabolical microbe, using again another one of Dr. McDonald's terms, actually is using our adaptivity against us.
Exactly. And when we're in that hyperreactive state, in that sympathetic dominance, the brain's learning capabilities get ramped up because it's a survival mechanism, right? It's like, okay, this is survival mode now. I need to be on point, and I need to be constantly ready to detect and learn and wire in what I perceive as a threat so that I can deploy that threat response pattern of inflammation in the future. So this is where it can kind of like spiral and build on itself, and where that getting in that space and starting to train in or condition in a new response can start to reverse that learning.
Okay, so now, Ben, I want you to use your reorigin tools on Matt Sabatello to analyze.
Wait, Rich, before you go there, I want to follow up on your previous question. Then we can analyze me. So we recently posted a graphic on social media about Lyme hiding within nematode parasites in the brain. And every time we do that, Ben, it just triggers people, right? Because they think, there's no medicine that's going to penetrate my blood-brain barrier that's going to be able to kill these nematodes and kill the Lyme inside the nematodes and all of these other bad things that exist in my brain because of Lyme and parasites from a tick-borne illness. And Rich and I always have to respond to these comments and encourage people, but how would you respond to that? If people have these nematode parasites in their brain that are protecting the Lyme bacteria, that are altering your brain pathways, can brain rewiring and these techniques help actually your body's innate defenses kill it on its own? And, if so, is it really as scary as people think when they respond to our social media posts?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have to say, this is certainly not my area of expertise. I would say that when you can help the body and the nervous system into a state where it is optimized for self-healing, the best chances of homeostasis arrive. But beyond that, I can speak very little I'm actually not familiar with what you're talking about, so I don't want to touch on it too deeply.
Well,
And
let me
Ben,
jump in, Matt.
okay.
I do want to jump in because part of what we learned here from Ben during this really great interview, Ben, you're doing a great job here. We're really enjoying this with you. Is that like one of the things that Ben had to learn was that is that what medical professionals should be doing for us is reestablishing the self-healing system, right? That's what medical professionals should be doing. That's what we should know about our systems, because part of the reason why so many of us cannot heal is because we are not properly educated in how to use our body, right? We don't know how to use our body. We don't know our body is essentially a self-healing system. We don't know what our brain is designed to. We don't know how our self-healing system works together. And because of that, we're in many cases making decisions to use modalities and to pursue treatments that aren't necessarily going to heal us. But Ben is a perfect example. He could show you proof positive. He had a brain with lesions, and then he didn't have a brain with lesions anymore.
Yeah.
And the gap between those two things was Ben understanding that place where he was free between the event of having brain lesions and the activities that he took to reestablish a self-healing system through learning how to control his brain and learning how to rewire his brain, that ultimately showed he was able to show on his TED Talk proof positive, lesions, no lesions, right, Ben?
Correct.
Yeah, and I'm with you on that. And I'm a firm believer that these things can be remedied, and so is Dr. McDonald, who discussed this on our podcast. But it's just scary, right? When people hear you have bugs in your brain, when people hear your brain is stuck a certain way, it, depending on where you're at, can trigger you into deeper fight or flight, right? And that's sort of my point here, Ben, is, you hear all these scary things. Oh my goodness, I have all these horrible things in my brain that I, was born with from my mom, because she had all these pathogens that flooded my system and came into my brain. Now I picked these things up all throughout my lifetime. There's no way I can get better. I don't care what you're telling me. And it becomes overwhelming to hear all this background. However, we have to find ways to overcome that fear and implement techniques both from, treatment modalities and brain rewiring modalities to help us overcome this and heal. And I think that's the barrier I'm asking. How do we broach that subject?
I see. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that. And that makes so much sense. That's exactly where I was. I think, look, whenever we talk about, certain things within the body, that when we approach it from a place of thinking about it as like there's damage done. I remember, in my 20s when I had like knee injuries and stuff, I became so depressed because I did not have, even with my background of like exercise and everything. And at that point, I didn't really have a firm handle on or understanding of adaptability and plasticity and change. And I'm not saying just brain plasticity, but the plasticity of our body tissue as well. And so when I got, joint tissue damage or something, I was like, in my mind, it was like, I started off with all my chips and now I've got half my chips and, it's all going to be downhill from here. Right. Not knowing that through physical therapy, through exercise, through movement, through, let's say motion is lotion, through a number of things we can do, tissue regenerates, limbs heal, things happen. So things can change. And then when it comes to, the brain, I think that emotional response gets extrapolated much further out, because it's like, we know that even for the layperson, which I was when I got that diagnosis of MS and had the brain scans come back with the lesions, we know that the brain is important. This is a really important thing. I do not want to have quote unquote brain damage, which technically I had. And so when you hear a neurologist and show you that you have brain damage, especially something of the nature that typically does not resolve, and I'll say when it comes to things like brain lesions, there's very little understanding of what actually causes brain lesions, and if they do go away, why they went away, or most of the time they don't. But yes, being in that place where anything close to your brain has happened can be extremely frightening. And for me, one of the biggest shifts and reprieves was just understanding the concept of neuroplasticity. When I learned that the brain is plastic, that the brain is malleable, and just like that wound that you can get on your thumb that heals itself, that the brain can do the same thing, that gave me hope. that got me out of that place of feeling stuck, like there was nothing else I could do or no place I could go but down, to feeling like, okay, I don't know how this is going to change. I don't know what to do yet, but I know that the brain changes. So let me look at some cases that were like me or worse than me, who's, were people where they were able to change their brains. And that gave me a tremendous amount of hope for myself.
So Ben, in answer to Matt's question, the way we should be responding to these folks on social media is to say, you are a self-healing machine, and you can assist yourself with your neuroplasticity and through your epigenetics to ultimately heal your system, right?
Yeah, I think if I could have just one message to get out on a billboard or something to blast out to people, it would be plasticity, malleability. You are not stuck, because I know from experience and talking to so many people that feeling is just the worst. It's a bad place to be. And it's a totally understandable place to be. When you've tried and been met with resistance so many times, it's totally understandable and easy to feel stuck. But I think that paradigm shift of, okay, nothing is truly static. Everything, including the human brain, can actually change itself. That gives a necessary glimmer of hope that can open that door just wide enough for us to put our foot through and start taking those steps.
So now let's take the next step, Ben, which is, one of the things we learned from Dr. Leo Shea, who is one of the Lyme pioneers, a psychologist, a brilliant psychologist, was that he argued to us that every single psychological symptom is really a physiological symptom. Everything, right? And I think you're making the same argument that, that all of what is happening is we have a brain that is reorganizing to serve us, right? We have this binary brain, fight or flight versus digest. And we, of course, our brain is always developing these shortcuts because it is such a resource hog of an organ that it has to come up with shortcuts. And now we just talked about a shortcut that everyone in the Lyme community has to deal with, which is, can I get better? Can my brain heal? And of course, what's happening is now this loop that we have in our brain, which again, remember, the loop is a belief. It presents itself as a belief, right? And the belief that, that Matt was just asking you to identify and to help us to deal with when we're dealing with on social media is, can I get better? Can my brain get better? And the answer to that question is, well, yeah, you have to believe you can get better in order to be able to get better, but it's understandable that you have this loop in your brain that leads you to believe that you cannot get better, right? I mean, and isn't that what you were arguing there, that because of these shortcuts in our brain, these shortcuts then present as beliefs, and these beliefs present as thoughts, these thoughts then begin to trigger as feelings, feelings then trigger as actions, and then we find ourselves in that really negative cybernetic loop.
Yep. Yeah. But what you're speaking about is there's a conditioning effect known as learned helplessness, where classic example is how elephants are trained to stay in captivity. A cuff is put around their ankle and they're staked into the ground. And so at a young age, they try to take steps forward to move. And every time the chain gets taut, they're met with some resistance around their ankle. And they say, oh, that's my limit. I can't go past that point. I'm not going to try anymore. And so after trying so many times, they simply give up because there's no point. At that point, the handler will actually remove the stake from the ground, remove the cuff, and the elephant stays put, stays within the boundaries of the confine that it learned are its limitations, because it was met with that resistance. And so it forms the belief, isn't even the right word. It's a neurological wiring that is associated with the boundary, that limit. Let's say it's like a certain marker at the edge or in the middle of the room. Its brain has identified that otherwise arbitrary mark with resistance. And so the brain will literally cut power to the elephant's limbs when it reaches that point because of the past conditioning, not knowing that it can actually step forward if it really wanted to.
Let's say that, man. So, but isn't that what a belief is? Isn't that really isn't that what every belief is? It's a neurological wiring that we have the ability to change.
Yeah. A really smart psychologist, one of the doctors who helped us design the program, Dr. Ken Gorfinkel, once said that he realized a large portion of his practice is about helping people realize a bigger scope of possibility for themselves. So many of the times, whenever we're feeling stuck physically, emotionally, psychologically, neurologically, we get into tunnel vision. And I don't know if you're familiar with Andrew Huberman Lab podcast.
I am.
Ophthalmologist. He talks a lot about this, the visual system and how that registers in the brain. But one of the things that happens, or that's interesting, is what's correlated with these so-called limiting beliefs are an actual narrowing of the visual field.
Because your beliefs control, but so stay with this, Ben, because your beliefs control cognition, right? Because our brain is really a big filter, and our brain cannot absorb all of the data that is available to us. And because our brain is limiting what it is that we have available to us cognitively, when we have these beliefs, which are nothing more than neurological loops, they are physiological, which, by the way, can be changed, as you proved repeatedly during the course of this podcast. Our cognition is being controlled, right? And that's the piece that I wanted to loop back to with my experience with Matt, right? When we first started this podcast, Matt was very sick. And one of the things that was really frustrating to me early on in the podcast is that Matt would be so sick at times, he wouldn't do the interviews with our guests on Lyme disease. And I didn't know a lot about Lyme disease, and I'm interviewing people on Lyme disease, right? And
it was a lot more than sometimes, Rich. You're being kind. It was often. So
we had this. And what I started to observe in Matt is that as time went on, Matt started to get better. But it's my belief that the reason he started to get better is because he believed he could get better, because he was listening to and interviewing people, person after person after person after person, who were demonstrating to Matt that he could get better. Now, yes, was Matt picking up little hacks? Was he picking up shortcuts that he could use physiologically? Sure. But I believe, Ben, and I'd like your reaction to this, that the reason Matt was able to get to the point where he is today, and it's been a huge, huge gap. You would not believe the man I first met a couple of years ago and compare him to the guy that is interviewing you today. I believe it was because he ultimately was able to change, as a result of having contact with all these people who are having success, the neurological loops that were keeping him enslaved. And because he was able to change those neurological loops as a result of all this experiential interaction that he had, it put him in a position where he could heal.
Oh man, there's a lot to dig into here. So this is, Matt, I don't know, is there anything you want to share? I'd love to hear from your the experience end of it, and then
I can tell you, Ben, in the beginning, Rich and I used to fight often, or debate, I should say, about, Rich would tell me 99% of healing is believing, right? It's in your head. 99% of healing is like
80%, Matt. Tell me remember 80%. It's 80-20 in my
I was 80. Okay. 80% of healing is psychological. It's all in your head, right? And I'm like, there's no way it's physical, and I was of the position of many people in the Lyme community, which is, this is a real illness. I have bacteria and viruses which contributed to my current condition. Because
I always believe that, by the way, Ben. I haven't said myself. I always believe that it was.
He did.
I believe it was a polymicrobial infection. So don't think I was just thinking it was an emotional illness.
So much of this was built off of my medical trauma and disbelief by doctors. So being in a hospital and having nurses tell my brother and closest friend that's all in my head, and if I don't take a vacation, I'm going to end up in the psych ward. So all of these experiences in life formed me to have these beliefs to debate with Rich early on. And I just simply couldn't believe, or even be open to the possibility, to the fact that this was largely a psychological barrier preventing me from getting better, because I knew there was something physiologically wrong in my body, right? So I had positive tests. What are you telling me, Rich? But the more I thought about it and the more we debated it, the more I realized that if I'm open to the fact that I can get better and I'm not stuck and I'm not damaged, as you said earlier, Ben, right? Because I think a lot of this was, there's damage in my body that I cannot over repair, and I'm going to accept that. I'm just going to live life as I am. Once I started to realize that I can make progress, I can heal, I can improve my quality of life, I started to take steps to do that. And I started to be more open-minded and see the world differently. So, my view today is far different than it was 3 years ago when Rich and I started this debate. And I believe that if it weren't for me having belief that I can feel better, I wouldn't be where I am today. So I do concede to Rich in that point of the argument, but I'm not sure I'm fully 100% with him on some of his arguments, Ben. So I'm curious to see where your thoughts are with this, as somebody who's gone through the experience and who is a neuroplasticity expert and has dedicated your life to studying this type of work.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. So let's talk about this broadening of awareness, this broadening of belief or sense of possibility for ourselves, because there is a neurobiological function or reason as to why this actually helps us. We have a large-scale network in the brain called the salience network. The salience basically what allows our brain to focus on specific sensations. We know that basically the short of it is that there's far too much information coming in through the senses than we can really process and attend to at any point. So the brain kind of filters out what it thinks is the most important. And again, because that first order of business is survival, it has this sort of what's known as the negativity bias, where it tends to focus its salience system around the things that are giving us a less than pleasant feeling. And these can be worries, these can be mental emotional thoughts, these can be physical sensations or symptoms. But whatever it is, that sensory input, when it's uncomfortable or we'll say negative, is given more weight. I think it was Kierkegaard, famous philosopher, wisely said that the entire world goes sour when you have a pain in your thumb, right? So that same salience mechanism that allows your brain to pick out the conversation that you're having with one person in an otherwise very crowded, noisy room will allow your brain, or have your brain, hone in on these, almost like the squeaky wheel, on these unpleasant sensations, and essentially magnify or further sensitize itself to take more signals from that area. Another way to think about it is like this. Imagine that there's this huge, vast football stadium, empty stadium, big, beautiful space. And there's one thing in the stadium. It's a little radio. Imagine there's this little red radio, kind of a squawk box, just making all this noise. And so a few people, start to gather around that radio because we think that's where the action is, not realizing that there's all of this other space. So when we experience a symptom, a worry, a fear, a thought like I'm stuck, I'm not going to get forward, I'm not going to move forward, or pain in the body, the mind will and the brain will take more signals from there at the exclusion of other experiences. Now, we're not saying that the experience you're having is false or it's not true. It might very well be the case that there's pain in your body, and that there's symptoms that you're feeling, and that there's a long road ahead, and that these worries might have some certain validity to them. So it's not to discount that or to challenge that. It is to say that there are other things going on as well. Out of this 11 million bits of information that's coming in through the brain per second, we're only taking in about 1% of that.
Actually, less. We're only taking in 9 bits.
9 bits. Thank you. So far less than 1% of that. So part of this self-directed neuroplasticity really boils down to what's known as reprocessing. And this is something that's been used very effectively in a modality form called PRT, or pain reprocessing therapy, and goes back to what Dr. Ken was saying about what he realized with his scope of practice, that it largely boils down to helping someone into a wider scope of awareness, where you can, once you're in that gap of stimulus and response, and I'll kind of get back to my own story and experience of it now. Once I was able to get there a little bit more reliably, the next thing I started to do was take some control and direct my awareness, right? So it's like, okay, in that little space, I have something that I didn't have before. I actually have control over where my attention goes, because previously my attention was being helplessly pulled into the pain, helplessly being pulled into the narrative, to the future worry, whatever it was. And in that space, which I now know is, being in that parasympathetic state, the brain has more bandwidth, and our attention network can actually become available for where we direct it. So the practice here.
Can I ask you to focus on one thing before you take that step, right? Because our brain, as you had pointed out, is survival software, right? It is designed to help us to survive primarily, right? And then, of course, you now talked about the salient system and the focus of our brain on the pain rather than the pleasure, because it is a survival software organ, right? But the next step we have, of course, is because we're filtering out, almost all of the data that's available to us. Mm-hmm. What happens when the salient system is focusing on one piece, Then we trigger the reticular activation system, and we get more and more and more of that information as time goes on. So can you give that piece to our listeners as well, where we're focusing on the pain? And I really love your example of being in a stadium and going to the radio. And now what's happening is the only reason we're seeing the radio is because our brain is bringing us back to the radio, because that's what our survival software has been triggered to do. And that's what the reticular activation system does to us. And it really makes it difficult for us to focus on anything other than that, unless we have tools the way you're developing.
Yeah. And so in neuroscience, what you're describing is referred to as reinforcement. This is part of a conditioning, pattern or learned behavior. When something becomes reinforced, it's effectively a confirmation, right? It's like you sense the pain in your thumb, then you tune in deeper to that pain, you feel the pain signal get increased, and the brain says, yep, good thing I tuned into that, there's pain there. And so it creates this strengthening of the neural pathways associated with taking the pain signals from that region of the body, whether the pain is warranted by what we referred to earlier as peripheral pathology, or it's just an increased level of our sensitization or sensitivity to that pain.
So now you can't see anything else, right? Because it controls your cognition. You literally can't see anything else.
Yeah.
You're just focusing on that, and your brain is looping back to it and looping back to it and looping back to it. And the myelin is getting thicker and it's getting thicker and it's getting thicker. And now the only thing you're taking in is that same 11 bits, the same 9 bits and nothing else, right? And that's why we're now stuck where we're stuck. But you're now arguing that there are tools that will allow us to expand our view and see what other opportunities are available to us. So can you talk about that now, build that out for us?
Yeah, and just to dovetail off of that, there's 2 components to learning. Whenever your brain is learning something, it's really learning 2 things. In the instance of focusing on pain or intensifying the attention to pain, it's learning to focus deeper on the pain. It's also learning not to pay attention to the surrounding environment, which is free of pain, right? To other aspects of reality that are coming into the senses, which might not be so painful. And so that is what we want to start to shift. And at the core of self-directed neuroplasticity and symptom or pain reprocessing, it's not about stopping the symptoms. This is something that I think is really important for people to understand. And I know it's very confusing and takes a little bit of, you have to wrap your head around it and experience it as well. But it's not about interrupting or stopping the symptoms themselves. What we're doing here is we are placing those symptoms in a much broader context. And in so doing, we are actually limiting and reducing our body's reactivity to them, because the brain puts a little bit less emphasis. Remember, we said that the brain wrongfully classifies these sensations as life-threatening threats, and unpleasant and undesired as they might be, they are not imminently life-threatening in the way that the brain responds to them. And so by placing them in this larger context, by saying, okay, yes, this pain is there in my thumb, or this heart palpitation, or this symptom, or this narrative that I feel stuck, or whatever it is. Like, it's not about resisting it, because we know also what you resist persists. In fact, it's about softening up against it. It's about withdrawing some of our attention from it and replacing that attention on the bigger context around it. Remember, so it's like, sure, you still hear that squawk box, that radio in the stadium, but you take a step back from it and you see, oh, wow, there's this huge arena here, and I can tune into that as well. And here's where the magic happens. The deeper we tune into that context over the content, the deeper we drop into the parasympathetic state, the less our brain starts taking those sensations through the salience network from that pain sensation, and it starts to actually subside. Inflammatory mechanisms and threat detection mechanisms start to get disarmed, so to speak, and the body starts to eventually default to a new state of calm and eventually homeostasis.
Ben, on this topic, though, a lot of people that are listening, and I know we're going to get the messages, so I'm just going to ask you now, so to curb us getting the ask, is everything you're saying sounds amazing, but it's a lot easier said than done, right? I've tried it. I've tried Gupta. I've tried Vital Side. I've tried all of them that are out there. I've done 3 or 4 different neuroplasticity programs and they're too rigid, or I've done them and I spent so much time and money and I'm worse off than I was before. How would you respond to that? And talk to us about how Reorigin is different than the other programs that are out there, and how the self-directed neuroplasticity can really help describe the process you just explained to us.
Sure. So this stuff is not complicated, but to your point, it is not easy, right? It is different, and it requires at first doing things that are uncomfortable and different from the way we've been practicing. And one of the things with Reorigin is we've had the benefit of working with a lot of people that have done a lot of brain retraining programs in the past and have come to us with a lot of questions. And one of the ways, although I certainly haven't done all of the neuroplasticity programs out there myself, I've done a handful of them in an effort to always learn. One of the ways that I think Reorigin is a little bit different is that our program is as dynamic as the human brain itself. It is not a static program by which you sit back and passively watch videos or take in information and then do a protocol just based on that. There are some fundamental principles when it comes to what I call doing neuroplasticity, or the act of changing your brain in a self-directed way, that I think apply across the board. But how you actually implement those, I believe, needs to be very personalized and customized. And so we have a process in our program whereby we walk you through really unpacking your own, what we call neurophysiologic loops. So you can really understand how and why your brain and body are reacting the way they are. And then you can graft on this protocol into a way that's more like a lock and key fit that will work better for you. In addition to that, we also have coaching. We have group and individual coaching that can help people custom tailor this. So I think that level of customizability and personalization and responsiveness is really key. Myself and the other coaches and moderators in the program, we're very involved. And in the program, it's very interactive as well. So when people go through it, they might be asked to share takeaways or comments or questions underneath, videos or certain areas of the community forum in the program. And so it's very dynamic, and we're constantly going through those comments and questions. And when we see certain patterns, we make shifts to the program. We create new videos. We hold events, online events that address those different topics. So here's an interesting way to kind of think about, doing neuroplasticity, and then we can get more specific. Imagine that you're trying to pull a fence post out of the ground. Imagine how hard it would be if you were trying to follow a protocol that told you exactly what angles and number of movements and repetitions you had to do to loosen up that fence post to pull it out of the ground. Instead, there are certain principles apply. Like a fundamental principle would be that the more you move it, the looser it gets, right? And then based on these principles and the conditions that you're operating in, however the ground is, how deep the post is dug, there is some degree of intuition that has to come into play here of how you're going to apply these principles. Basically, in this case, wiggling around the fence post in certain ways until the ground around it gets looser so that you can just easily lift it out of the ground. So when we're trying to loosen this grip that our brain has on these symptoms, there are different sort of wiggling maneuvers that we can do to feed back new information to the brain, and particularly to the limbic system. And just to give you an example of how dynamic the Reorigin program is, visualization is certainly something that we use, but there are visual learners, there are kinesthetic learners, and there are auditory learners. Visualization is not necessarily the immediate go-to that works for everyone. So we have a whole toolkit of ways that you can feed new information back to the limbic system through somatics, through changing your breathing pattern, your posture, of course, reciting different scripts, visualization, but also auditory, listening to certain sounds or music that can assist you into a different state. And then the personalized aspect of helping people learn how to combine these tools in a way that's going to work for you to broaden that scope and loosen the foundation around those symptoms, I've seen has been really, pivotal and essential for a lot of people.
Yeah, I look at this, Ben, if I'm listening to this podcast and I'm super interested in neuroplasticity, and now I'm really interested in reorigin, right? If you could just give us a little bit more detail about if somebody wanted to go to your website, and I think it's reorigin.com, is that correct?
Yep.
Reorigin.com, and they wanted to sign up. What does it look like to be a part of Reorigin and participate in your neuroplasticity program? Are we talking several hours a day engagement, a half hour? And what kind of work, at a high level would be done in this program? Just to give people a little more understanding of exactly what they're walking into if they decide to sign up with you.
Yeah. So the first thing they'll do is they find themselves in a community platform. It's available on a mobile browser or web app, web app or mobile app. And it functions very much kind of like a social media at first glance. So it's very intuitive to use for most people. Very unlike social media, however, it is highly curated, such that everything being shared there has been laid out and shared based on neuroscience principles. So we employ things like the science of small wins, everything that we've just been talking about of belief effects, which are currently being studied at Stanford, are being utilized in the information that is presented from the moment you walk in the door, so to speak, at Reorigin. Now, once someone is in the community, the journey really begins with going through a series of videos. Our video program is collectively about 7 hours, but it's broken down into bite-sized 5 to 10 minute videos that people can go through at their own pace. Some people will go through the whole thing in a weekend. Other people will take up to 4 weeks. The only real guideline that we provide in terms of self-pacing is to try to go through all of the videos within about 4 weeks, just to not get too far, have the information be too far spread apart. As I mentioned, as people are going through, they are actually participating in things right from the beginning. They're doing exercises. They might be asked to fill out worksheets or leave a certain takeaway or something under a video. And that's done for a very specific neuroscience reason, that we employ active learning as opposed to passive learning. When I went to survival school, which I spoke about in my TED Talk, I remember being bombarded with all of these lessons. They were teaching us about thermoregulation and night vision and all these different things and how to modulate your body's energy levels. And I was like, why are they throwing all of this information at me? And then they left me alone. And I was like, oh, okay, now I get it. And all of a sudden, all of these things that I had just learned had to be utilized. And well, we're certainly not going to leave you alone or leave you hanging or put you in some sort of scenario like that. The point is that when you learn and then apply right away, you remember. Your brain, it really gets wired in. And to this day, now 10 years later, after that experience, I still remember every aspect of the things that I learned in that survival school, because it was learning and applying right away. So they'll go through the program, they'll learn and apply these different techniques, and then they'll start really practicing them. Now, to your question about how long this takes, this is a question that comes up all the time. I do these live info calls that anyone can join. If you go to the website now and click on book a call, you will join a group call with myself. I do these 2 to 3 times a week. And the question always comes up, one, how long does this take? Like, what's the time investment per day, which is a great question. And number 2, how long is it going to take me to get better, right? That's a question that comes up all the time. So the first one is that we have found that there is a sort of optimal therapeutic dose of practicing the reprocessing or brain retraining exercises, which is about 30 minutes a day. Now, in alignment with the first thing I mentioned, which is science of small wins and consistency being the most important thing, we always tell people, shoot for what is attainable, not for what is optimal. If what is your sweet spot when you come in is 1 minute a day, then that's what you should do. What you do is second to that you do. And in the long run, if I could say what's the one most important thing when it comes to brain retraining, it is really a matter of consistency over time. And this doesn't mean, consistency does not mean perfection. Certainly there are days when we fall down, we forget, we don't do it right. The great news is that there's no limit to the number of chances you can pick yourself back up and start again. But we do want to set ourselves up for success. And so for most people, we encourage them to start with just a few minutes a day, and then a la incremental training, work their way up to that total training time of about 30 minutes a day, which even then can be broken down into, say, 2 15-minute sessions a day or 3 10-minute sessions a day, however you want to kind of configure it. But yeah, that is the sort of answer to the first question. We work our way up to that 30 minutes. And then there are some things that we can do. We have short versions of the technique that take about 5 seconds that are meant to be done in the moment to kind of quickly snap ourselves back into that pre-rehearsed state of parasympathetic response.
And I just want to clarify, when I said your website, it's actually re-origin.com, I believe, right?
Yeah,
so it's re-origin.com.
Correct.
So the final question we're going to get asked, and I'm just trying to get ahead of all the questions we're going to get here, is, pricing wise, is this a subscription model? Is it a one-time cost? It looks like you have a free demo. So can you just get a little bit into about your pricing model for people to join your program?
Yeah, so it is a one-time cost. People can join the program for, I think it's $297, is the program itself. There they have access, 1-year access to the program and the community. Part of the community includes live weekly Q&As with myself and Katie, who's the head coach, as well as events. Every month or so, we'll have a guest expert come. We've had members of the Reorigin Brain Trust. This includes Dr. Kelly Kent, neuroscientist, and Dr. Ken Gorfinkel, psychologist. We've had all sorts of experts and interesting people come. And so when people join, they'll get access to attend those events when we have them. They'll also get access to the video recordings of the sort of content library that we've, started to amass over the last couple of years. For the people that want a little bit more, accountability and support, the group coaching is really phenomenal here. This is something that about 40% of the members tend to include in the onset. They can also add it on later on once they've, gotten familiar with the program and community. But that has proven to be really valuable for a lot of people. And this is even speaking, from a person who was not really a group person myself. I was always more of like a solo, figure it out myself kind of kid. I have actually benefited tremendously in recent years from the power of coming together with people, having a weekly set time, and having people cheer each other on, support each other, and having that sense of, just support, motivation, and accountability is huge. There also is a kind of arc to those groups. There is a curriculum that occurs over the 12 weeks where they go deeper into specific aspects of the program. So there's a lot of value, and those sessions equate to about $79 a month for 3 months. So they are time bound to 12 weeks at a time.
Well, I want to encourage everybody to go check out, at a minimum, your free trial on your website, because this has been a fascinating discussion. And we can keep you. I think we've had you probably well over 2 hours now. So I will let Rich jump in with his final thoughts. But Ben, we just want to thank you for coming on and sharing all your knowledge and, providing hope and inspiration for people in the community. Because as you know, and as I know, so many of us become stuck and we just accept where we're at. And you just crushed those false beliefs that we can't get better. And, the Lyme community needs more hope and people like you to come out here and publicly speak and say, hey, you can get better. Don't give up and don't lose sight of health, because it's possible. So thank you.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate that.
So that I likewise am going to encourage folks in our community to work with you. And I think we should sort of end this the way we began this. And it all is your brilliant program, and the way you've described it, I think is all driven by this understanding that we can respond with ability, that there is this space between these events that are causing us to be sick and the way we respond to them. And the way you can start to overcome these challenges is with one deep breath.
Absolutely. It starts in one place, right? We just get our foot in that door and we realize that there is a world of possibility. And I think moving from that place mentally, emotionally, psychologically, and neurologically, from feeling stuck to knowing that there is a bigger possibility for yourself, is the essential first step this journey of healing that I know that we all can go on and are on. So I just want to thank you guys for having me on the podcast. And this was a really fun conversation.
Thank you for listening to our Tick Bootcamp interview with our guest, Ben Ahrens. To our listeners, we have a call to action. First, if you'd like to learn more about Ben Ahrens, please visit his website at reorganize.com, re-orgins.com. Second, if you enjoyed this episode of the Tick Bootcamp podcast, please share it to your friends on social media. Third, Tick Bootcamp is created to Tick by Blueprint. It has been inspired by the information been shared with us by past guests on this podcast. We urge you to visit our website at tickbootcamp.com/bite to view the blueprint. Fourth, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify to get your automatic episode updates of our Tick Bootcamp podcast. Please take a minute to leave us an honest review on the podcast platform of your choice. And finally, if you'd like to search our podcast library of almost 350 episodes, subscribe to our email list, or share feedback, please visit our website at tickbootcamp.com. Thank you, as always, for listening.